If you're a shoujo fan, you've probably been forced into this exact type of conversation at least once before. I hate shoujo manga. Why is that? There's plenty of great titles that are out there. Well, I hate it because it's all wish fulfillment romance. Shoujo isn't just romance, though. The ones I've read have all been 70 volumes long of the couple bickering back and forth and never committing until the very last chapter where they finally confess and then it just ends.
Oh, hell no, man.
Almost always, a conversation like this one ends up with the person who hates shoujo inadvertently admitting that they're wrong. Or, at the least, they're very misguided. Because the shoujo they've said that encapsulates all these tropes end up being shonen and seinen manga. The main offenders are usually Inuyasha, Kaguya-sama, Komi can't communicate, or miraculously, sometimes I will even hear people say rent-a-girlfriend. This isn't anything new. There has always been a conflation of romance anime and manga being made specifically just for girls. No matter how much fan service and titty ogling might be present, if romance is an aspect, then it must be made for girls to check out. For an avid romance watcher or reader though, this comes as no surprise. It has long been assumed that any media with romance in it is the purview of women, often derided by critics and non-readers alike, despite it being one of the best-selling genres of fiction on the market. It gets pinned with derogatory names such as chick flicks, chick lit, bodice rippers, mommy porn, etc. None of which really inspire a great level of admiration or respect from the public.
Do you need a book to get turned on?
No.
What do you need?
Anything.
Don't look at me.
Thus, the romance genre is considered frivolous media, unsuitable for men with good taste. It's highly emotional, with unrealistic expectations of men. How are they supposed to get a girl if she has ideals for heterosexual romance that go beyond just the bare minimum? A man should just be able to fall into a romance against his better judgment anyway. Sarcasm heavily implied, because it's not like men don't love romance too. Just look at a recent poll from Talker Research showing that 63% of men are reading romance fiction. It's also especially true that men love romance when it comes to anime and manga, where the romance genre, especially as of late, have been dominated by titles written and marketed for men. Just like how romance has tapped into the psyche of women and shows them their desires, so too does the shonen demographic of romance fiction, who consists largely of male readers. In light of this consistent misconception, I have decided it's time to lay down the law. No more saying shoujo is longer than 15 volumes on average of will they, won't they. That is just not the case anymore. So I want to break down the difference in tropes for romance manga depending on the demographic that they are published in. How does the male-targeted romance differ from the female-targeted romance when it comes to their leading ladies, or when it comes to their commonly used setups? To help show these differences, we'll be comparing and contrasting 4 shonen and shoujo series that were and are very popular with readers. This is not to show that one is better than the other, so don't get it twisted, but rather this is to give us the whole picture on how these demographics approach their target readership. Speaking of rom-coms, are you looking for a new manga to sink your teeth into? Then Yen Press has got you covered, with the release of Thank You for Taking Care of Our Boy Banri, a highly anticipated new series from the author Chitose Kaido, creator of Love and Heart. Yen Press is one of the largest manga publishers in English, bringing over beloved titles like Delicious in Dungeon and Fruits Basket. So that just means you know this new series is gonna be good too. Thank You for Taking Care of Our Boy Banri is about a college girl named Nanase who becomes the temporary manager of popular new actor Banri. However, it turns out Banri isn't how he shows himself to the public, making Nanase's new job more than she bargained for. Will these two mismatched coworkers spark a romance, or will the fire fizzle out? This manga is going to be perfect for anyone who is a fan of enemies to lovers or workplace romances. With gorgeous cover art featuring the sparkling idol Banri, you'll want to pick up the series immediately. And luckily, right now, you can do just that from your your local bookstore, Amazon, or the Yen Press store. Just make sure to click the link in my description to check it out. And once again, thank you to Yen Press for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back to it. We're gonna wind it back a bit though, because it would be helpful to start with the basics for anyone who is unfamiliar with the romance genre. Oftentimes, people think certain tropes belong just to shoujo romance, when in actuality, those tropes have probably been around since when Shakespeare wrote Midsummer Night's Dream.
Let me get this straight. You like Gwen, Gwen likes Zach, Zach likes Vanessa, and Vanessa likes you. Exactly. Well, who likes me? No one.
Romance, like any other genre fiction, has its own array of settings, conventions, and tropes that are reused and recycled to appeal to readers who are familiar with the genre. Much like how the mystery will always have a keen detective, and thrillers will always have a gruesome murder. For a clearer idea of the typical plotting of a romance series, let's go ahead and look at the famous movie Pretty Woman. The heart of the conflict lies between the two leads that keeps them from dating, or a hurdle for a couple to overcome. In Pretty Woman, the conflict starts as a fake dating arrangement and hiding of the female lead's occupation as a prostitute. They also add in the conflict that the female lead struggles with falling for someone despite knowing that she shouldn't. All staples which give a central struggle of the self. Romances will then follow the couple's trials and tribulations before ultimately a happy ending is reached, i.e. they start dating or admit their feelings. When it comes to traditional romance novels, this happy ending is usually marriage, sex, or babies. However, this is more atypical for modern rom-coms, especially in the romance manga we'll be discussing, considering most of these titles involve teenagers. While shonen and shoujo might share the same genre and the conventions that are attached to it, it doesn't mean that these two demographics are going to share the same kind of stories. There are very stark differences in the characters and the writing choices between the two. I'm gonna go ahead and head this off real quick. This is not because of any perceived differences in the sexes. I do not believe in the binary thinking of women are all kind and gentle and men are all sex-crazed maniacs. And you should not believe this either, just my opinion. The difference between these two are just there because of the societal values that are implemented on boys and girls and the heterosexual relationships that they may or may not engage in. Add into this mix the privileges or lack thereof for these demographics in society, and you'll end up with two entirely different manga by the end. Once again, romance, like all fiction, is a form of fantasy. When you read a crime drama, it's that good is always going to prevail over evil. So when you read a romance, the fantasy is that no matter what, the two leads will always end up with a happily ever after, making romance a kind of wish fulfillment and escape from everyday life. In shonen romance, there is a kind of satisfaction for young adolescent boys reading about down on their luck guys that are acknowledged by the hottest and most hard to get girl in their class. Through forced situations like being accidental neighbors, they can see their dreams come true. In these kinds of series, the girl forgoes the jock or the chad and realizes the true potential of the geeky underdog, showing that you as the reader could still be preferred over the masculine stereotype. On the other hand, wish fulfillment titles for girls like My Happy Marriage or Honey Lemon Soda center around a girl who is shy or bullied. She may have a hard time forming bonds with classmates until a cool, roguish boy from their class shows up to help. These stories are usually more about being seen for who you are on the inside, as the boy falls in love with the girl for her kindness, her gentleness, and resilience. In both cases, these demographics pinpoint the fears and anxieties of their target readership and reflect them back to them in an optimistic light. However, they have evolved as the times have changed, and preferences changed with it. So let's go ahead and start with the 80s and 90s, where much like their Hollywood counterpart, manga was also having a rom-com boom. This largely came about because of two different titles, Urusei Yatsura for boys and Boys Over Flowers for girls, both of which were long-running titles featuring a mismatched couple who would bicker all the time and play in a mental game of tug of war. In fact, many romance series in this era would run for long periods of times, upward of 30 plus volumes, before the two characters would ever confess and then run happily off into the sunset. People actually used to like the chase back then. The key differences in the approach to the conflict in these two series lies in how it deals with the romance, though. For shonen, romance was often masked under a layer of nervousness. This was a time in which men were in fear of losing their long-held social status due to the rising tide of second-wave feminism. A big reason for this domination of nervous romances was because of certified weirdo and friend of Jeffrey Epstein, Woody Allen. His films like Annie Hall and Manhattan were pivotal in making the rom-com more accessible to male audiences. The nervous romance is also where we see the roles switched for the leads. Suave men are no longer chasing women as potential marriage partners. These dudes just want a quick lay, and now it's the women who chase desperately after the men. Much like in the seminal shonen rom-com, Urusei Yatsura. Urusei Yatsura is a comedic romance series from beloved author Rumiko Takahashi that was published in Shonen Sunday. The series follows a boy named Moroboshi who is plagued with bad luck and becomes the object of desire for a female alien named Lum. Throughout the story, she ruins his chances with his human girlfriend time and again as she chases him desperately for his hand in marriage. Across the manga, Moroboshi is shown as a lecherous high schooler, constantly looking at other women despite his relationship status. Sometimes these lecherous moments are an accident, like in chapter 1 where he rips off Lum's bralette. This kind of lucky pervert character became a primary archetype in shonen rom-coms for a good while. It allowed sexual situations to happen without making the main lead the instigator, as well as allowing characters to engage in romantic encounters without having dating or marriage be the end goal. Even when these characters constantly get rebuked or slapped due to their lustful pining, the girl will always come back to fawn all over him. The wish fulfillment here is that boys can still be sexually promiscuous and interested in women without losing the ability to ultimately settle down into the patriarchal standard whenever they're ready, moving from adolescent boyhood to adulthood when the love of a good, patient woman comes along. In contrast, shoujo romance series in this decade shooed off the romance of the 70s, which favored pessimistic views of dating. They instead followed the tried and true fairy tales, Harlequin novels, and screwball comedies of the 30s and 50s, like Roman Holiday. Paperback romance novels like Harlequin are said to be codified in myths, constantly reworked into new formats for repeat enjoyment and fantasy, whereas screwball comedies idealizes the heterosexual love that is based on playfulness and charisma. The conventions of these romantic traditions encapsulate why Boys Over Flowers was so popular with girls, to the point where it completely changed the landscape of shoujo romance until at least the 2010s. Boys Over Flowers tells the story of a poor girl named Tsukushi who attends a prestigious school where a group of boys known as the F4 bully anyone who defies them. Tsukushi at first remains meek and avoids them, however she finally stands up to these boys after a bad incident. She kicks their leader of the pack, Domyoji, in the head and declares war on him. Thus, the chase between the two begins. It's obvious to many how this series falls back on several reworked fairy tales such as Beauty and the Beast and Cinderella, both of which are instantly identifiable romantic tales, allowing the readers to understand the tropes and what to expect from the story upon the first chapter. Most notably, Boys Over Flowers employs the taming of the beast trope. This trope is characterized by an aggressive and sometimes violent male lead who is only reformed when he falls in love with a headstrong woman. This trope also happens to be one of the biggest criticisms most people have with romance novels, usually citing how it reinforces the idea that women are wanting men to be violent with them. Now, it's always going to be tricky territory when you are trying to defend a trope like this, and I'm not going to say that this is me defending it either. But I do think it's important to contextualize why this trope is so popular with many straight women in the first place. When reading Dangerous Men and Adventurous Women, which is an essay book written by a few different romance writers, the essayists recommend viewing it more through the lens of a duel rather than real life. The man plays the role of both the hero and the villain in the story, and the heroine must defeat the villain to free the hero. Much like how in Boys Over Flowers, Domyoji is this very violent, aggressive, and sensitive man, and it's through the spunky heroine Tsukushi that he sees it in himself to change his attitude. This is used as an allegory to remove the power from the hero and give it to the heroine as hers to wield. A type of optimistic fantasy wherein the heterosexual relationship doesn't set aside the female lead, but instead makes her the one who is in control of the relationship. Urusei Yatsura and Boys Over Flowers completely changed the landscape of rom-com manga. Though, while this is where the genre has derived from, that doesn't mean it has stayed completely the same. In both manga and in cinema, the rom-com has changed with the times. Still playing on these same conventions, but morphing with the current day fears, politics, and culture. As we've progressed in society, even marginally, with women's rights and gay marriage, the heterosexual romance has to change with it. Since the early 80s, male-centered romance media went from the nervous romance to the modern slacker-striver romance, or the geek romance. One that centers a down-on-his-luck geek who gets the girl, often through no means of his own. When it comes to Hollywood, this change was largely attributed to Judd Apatow, creator of movies like 40-Year-Old Virgin and Knocked Up. He took cues from the nervous romances, the sex comedies, and the rise of geek culture that happened in the 80s, and made a new kind of rom-com that was exclusively targeting men. Instead of the traditional masculine male leads that would gain swoons from women like Carrie or Hugh Grant, he opted to cast more schlubby guys like Seth Rogen or Steve Carell, which appealed to the everyman, citing his own feelings of being underappreciated as a kid. I think that everything I do tends to root for the underdog. I always felt as a kid that I was underappreciated, invisible, or weird, but I've always secretly thought people would one day appreciate what is different about me. I'm always putting the message out there. Eventually, the nerds and the geeks will have their day. Judd Apatow has had a stranglehold on the rom-com from the mid to late 2000s thanks to the success of so many of the movies in his Apatow empire, which in turn led the rom-com to heavily lean on the male-centered geek romance, both in Hollywood and in manga. Though I will say geeks were already having their cultural moment in the 2000s because hobbies like comic collecting, gaming, and anime were becoming more mainstream. This is a natural progression because a new generation was being raised by the generation growing up on the rise of geek culture with franchises like Star Wars or Gundam. Great examples of this new rise of the male-centered geek romance in manga are titles like My Dress-Up Darling, Rent-a-Girlfriend, Don Dadan, Komi Can't Communicate, Horimiya, Quintessential Quintuplets, all of which center on some kind of loner guy who has some sort of unusual aspect to him, whether it be his appearance or hobbies, and they suddenly gain the attention of the most beautiful, popular girls in school. Most of these manga run for long periods of time, just like back in the 80s, as many of them still focus more on the sex comedy aspects rather than just the romance. Sometimes these male-centered geek romances fall into the buddy comedy genre too, much like how Judd Apatow's movies will, because the male-male bonds is often seen as more important than female-male bonds. A specific manga which highlights the change from the lecherous teen boy to the geek-centered teen boy is Dangers in My Heart, an episodic rom-com about a high school boy named Ichikawa who is obsessed with gore and wants to see his hot, popular female classmate Yamada killed. However, he is too shy to ever approach, let alone speak to her, finding himself watching her from a corner as she gets up to silly antics. While it has some similarities with Urusei Yatsura in that it's a sex comedy with the woman chasing the man, there are key differences within the wish fulfillment for the reader. Those are the geek melodrama and voyeurism. Quick side note, I'm going to steer clear of the misogynistic opening chapter where a young boy wants to murder and violate his female classmate just because she's hot. Not because I don't think the framing of this in the story isn't important, but mostly because The manga also seems to quickly ditch this premise right after chapter 1 too. The other reason I'm not analyzing it more is because it's not an emblematic trope of the male-centered geek romcom, which is what we are specifically talking about. Starting with the melodrama, it is crucial to these kinds of series that you are sympathetic to the male lead. While he is still privileged in his male or middle-class status, he needs to be marked as an other due to his physical attributes or maybe his interests. The melodrama can then be induced because it makes him suffer at the hands of the jocks who bully him or the women who scorned him, playing into this idea that the geek is an oppressed social class because they are not the pinnacle of masculinity. By placing us into the POV of Ichikawa, the story is asking us to sympathize with his geek status and think that his suffering is justified. Just because he's not hot or sociable doesn't make him a bad person. In fact, it's actually the other boys in the class or the playboy who hits on Yamada that are the scumbags who sexualize her. Despite the fact that the series still employs the tropey sex comedy moments where our main character fantasizes about Yamada and what she would look like during sex, accidentally seeing through her top, or getting a boner due to a light touch on his leg. We are still asked to sympathize with Ichikawa though because of his geek melodrama. He is still morally righteous because he's not outwardly aggressive or sexual to these girls. This leads us to another signature of the geek rom-com, which is voyeurism. Whether that be stalking, peeping toms, or a deep interest in porn, as Carter Souls writes. The geek is usually a connoisseur of visual media, such as film or comic books, and this emphasis upon visual consumption extends to his tendencies toward voyeurism, stalkerism, and an interest in porn. The emphasis on voyeurism is why fan service moments are so prevalent in shonen. The demographic is largely targeted to the exact kind of geek who would have this predilection for visual consumption. See also why the male gaze is so prevalent in most media too. Surprisingly though, Dangers in My Heart's voyeurism comes less from like lucky pervert moments or fan service, or at least in the first volume, which is what I read for this video. Instead, this voyeurism is more utilized through having the main character follow the female lead around, whether that be watching her or narrating her every action. Lucky voyeurism, perhaps. I would definitely not describe the main character's actions as stalking, nor would I really say he gains sexual pleasure from watching her in the library. I do, however, think it's considered voyeurism because the entirety of the first volume takes place through Ichikawa's POV and is entirely narrating all of her actions. There are cases where it definitely leans more into the stalking aspects, like when Ichikawa sees Yamada get hit by a ball and starts bleeding from the nose and follows her into the nurse's office. By doing so, he hides himself underneath a cot and overhears a family conversation she has, which is more intimate. This type of voyeurism is shown as an imagined relationship that Ichikawa is having with Yamada before they form any actual true bond. When it comes to shoujo, the taming of the beast trope has also morphed to fit the current climate and the general mood towards romance. Not many girls these days want to go through the effort of taming a man to soften his heart. He should already be softened. It should come as no surprise that this is becoming the norm due to the fact that there is a rise in right-wing ideology and sexism across the world. Although some others do speculate that this current type of doting male lead comes from the current generation's fear of rejection and lack of confidence. Either way, the male lead must have already been conquered upon first meeting. He's in love with the heroine right away and shows it through words of affection or doting. That doesn't entirely mean there isn't a quality of danger though, as the doting man can come in many forms outside of just a guy who is perfect and does everything for you. There have been tons of examples of this kind of romance coming out of shoujo in the past few years, like A Condition Called Love, Firefly Wedding, Springstorm and Monster, Fuka Koyoku no I Love You, and At Taro's Mercy, all of which see the relationship form early on and focus more of the rest of the story on their dating and moments in between. There's actually a second trend that has coincided with this desire for a doting male lead, and that is the rise of the otaku female lead. Unlike geek culture for men, girls have often been left out of the geek conversation unless it's as a punchline to how unappealing she is as a woman. Sure, in the past years of shoujo manga, girls have been plain or book smart, but never geeky or hyper-fixating on a hobby because that was the realm of boys. Now though, fandom culture for J-pop or K-pop idols, BLs, streamers, VTubers have all been visibly taken over by young girls. They've carved out their own geek spaces with cultures that are specific to their oshis or their faves, such as taking photos of acrylic standees or nuis at cafe pop-ups for their oshi, or decorating entire ita bags in their faves merch. Unlike the shy, unsociable geeks in the shonen demographic, the geeky female leads take up the space in the shoujo. They're loud, weird, passionate, and sometimes extroverted. They have a fair few friends from their hobbies already, and they don't really have an interest in romance because they're too focused on their favorite thing. Often, they also don't really want to date the male lead who presents themselves as the romantic interest, even when they do eventually end up together. The hit shoujo series Tamon's B-side mixes both of these tropes together by presenting the male lead as a gentle, doting, but somewhat dangerous guy, whereas the protagonist is an otaku who aggressively keeps her distance from him. For those unfamiliar, the series is about a girl named Utage who is obsessed with the playboy J-pop idol Tamon from Face. One day during her housekeeper job, she gets a call to an apartment complex for a man with the same name, and it turns out to be Tamon, her idol, though his offstage personality is extremely different. He's actually an anxious, depressed, and cowardly man. Tamon as a character is actually a great dichotomy of the popular kind of male lead from the 80s and 90s versus now. His idol persona might be this idealized playboy who needs to be tamed by the love of a good woman, but Tamon's B-side is the gentle, doting guy that is preferred nowadays. He needs no taming from the female lead because simply being who she is, he has already fallen in love with her. Even if he doesn't know it yet, there's no doubt in the reader's eyes that these two characters won't end up together by the end. The only real obstacle in this story is Tamon's obsessive desire to please Utage, although this never harms her in the long run. Utage, on the other hand, is the typical female lead of the modern era of girlhood. She isn't overly shy or passive and cares more about her hobbies than getting a boyfriend, working perfectly as a placeholder or identifier for the Gen Z teen girl who has many different hobbies and passions and also works multiple jobs to keep up with it. Utage also having access to the object of her affections frames this series in a setting of fan fiction as well, utilizing a new form of myth creation that girls have been creating since fandom started to arise. Now, between the shonen and shoujo demographic tropes we've talked about, these are just the most popular ones. They make up the largest amount of sales for best-selling manga and are commonly seen across all magazines. Just because they're prevalent, though, doesn't mean that they are the only ones to exist. With millions and millions of manga out there, of course, there are going to be plenty of subversions of these tropes that are just as popular. Everyone has their own tastes and unique preferences, after all. Shonen, which can perpetuate misogynistic views on women and masculinity, has been adding male leads who are softer. These series still have the qualities of the nervous romance from the 70s, and that the male lead is anxious about his actions or dating. But in contrast to what's popular now, they aren't really concerned in the geek melodrama or voyeurism. An example of this could be seen in the series Fragrant Flower Blooms with Dignity. The male lead is a relatable everyman still because he's misunderstood, but he's kind, gentle, and respectful of his peers. It serves as an example of healthy masculinity in that it does not rely on the objectification of its female lead or the male lead having to be tamed to become the hero. Although, I do still think work could be done in the characterization of the female leads in these types of series, because they often become the manic pixie dream girl who saves the poor, listless, melancholic boy from sad life. Over on the shoujo side, we're seeing female leads become less of the idealistic placeholders for readers, and allowing them to show more negative character traits. Yes, these shoujo female leads have always been stubborn, willful, or outspoken, but they have never been self-congratulatory or confident in their appearance. The perfect example of this new kind of female lead can be seen in the series Fall in Love, You False Angels, where the female lead takes pride in her appearance rather than making herself feel small. She has a crude attitude, but only hides this personality because she knows what other people expect from her, which is being cute and nice. This ends up subverting the shy, humble femininity that is often expected from young girls and shown to us in shoujo series. It gives us a good look at what self-acceptance, confidence, and individuality could look like for girls, where it doesn't have them looking down on others in the meantime. Romance may have always been viewed as women's work, but heterosexual relationships take more than one party. Meaning, heterosexual men, no matter the eye rolls or complaints that they give, enjoy romance just as much as they say all women do. Which is why the likes of Woody Allen, Judd Apatow, and shonen romance are so popular. People may conflate shoujo and shonen romance as being all the same just because they're under the same genre, but there are different tropes for different folks in both demographics. Saying all shoujo are 70 plus volumes of will they won't they situationships haven't been the case for years, just like the pervy, lecherous teen boy hasn't been in shonen. Like all genre fiction, romance has grown along with the readers who enjoy it. And these tropes change along with the target readership too. Now, that's my time, so go on, get out of here. Go read an actual shoujo romance series and stop complaining about them for once. Real quick before we go, I want to ask you guys a quick question. Would you guys buy this Shoujo Connoisseur basketball jersey? I made these specifically for a friend and my brother-in-law, but I wasn't actually going to sell them, and when I got the samples, I was like, okay, I actually kind of like this. So if you guys want one of these too, let me know in the comments. I would be happy to make this more into a merch item, so just let me know.